going to introduce you by saying it's a great pleasure to have a chance to talk to Paul Flather.
Yeah.
Paul, when and where were you born?
Well, I was born actually in Essex in 1954, although my childhood was really in India. My mother actually flew over to give birth in a nursing home in England, I think to sort of underscore that I would have an English antecedent, and my father who was English. So 1954 in Essex. I've never been back to the nursing home. It was in Chelmsford. I'm sure it's actually I'm not sure it still exists.
Right, well, I always ask about ancestry, but in your case it's a particularly important question. Tell me about your ancestors.
Well, I don't know a lot about my father's side, so I'm going to focus on my mother's side. She had a very, very distinguished great-grandfather. So my great-great-grandfather was at various times the leading engineer in the British Raj. And he is, and I often speak about him because he's a great builder of wonderful buildings all over Pakistan, because the family was based in Lahore, and Lahore, like Lucknow, was one of those cities which mixed Hindu and Muslim culture in a very open and didactic and intercultural way, and it was just one of the great cities of the world actually. And the British commissioned him to build famous buildings, schools, colleges. He built Aitchison College, which was one of the famous colleges. He wasn't the architect, but he was a great designer, and he was madly keen on the British.
What was his name?
His name was Gangaram, and for his great skills he was eventually knighted, and he rose to such prominence that the Governor-General, who by then was Curzon, later Chancellor of Oxford, actually wrote to the company board in Britain to suggest that he should be the engineer general. And after much deliberation, they wrote back and said, well, we can see that he has all the qualifications except one. He has brown skin, and therefore he can't be appointed. And he promptly resigned, set up his own practice, and went on to develop a lift irrigation system, copied from a lift system he'd spotted in a Gloucestershire agricultural fair during a visit in the 1880s. And eventually ends up irrigating much of the Punjab, which is now the breadbasket of India. So really a very famous son of India. He sits on the Royal Commission of Agriculture in the 1920s. He's incredibly loved, and critically, I think most famously, he decides at a certain point in his 70s to give away his fortune. And he sets up a college for women, a technical college, a school, a charity for the child widows, because often people were married when they were children, and then when their child partner died, the family had to get rid of them because they were a burden. And so there were many kids wandering around, and he set up and for the elderly as well. I mean, he's a wonderful character. So from that antecedent comes a whole bunch of very interesting children. And my grandfather is very interesting. He's a kind of businessman who is very close to Nehru. And when my family is displaced in 47 in partition, because we were the leading Hindu family in Lahore, and we waited on tenterhooks to know whether, of course I wasn't born, but my mother was I think 11 at that time, waiting to hear which side of the border Lahore would be drawn. And eventually, just at the last minute, Lahore is put into Pakistan. And there was still a feeling, well, maybe we can stay on. But eventually the house is surrounded. Some of the servants are murdered, according to family stories. And my mother and grandmother rush to the airport and go to America, where her brother is studying. And the rest of the family pile into 3 trucks, which are lent by the chief of police. So the family is so well known that the chief of police actually lends them a few trucks. They grab a few things, including some silver forks, and drive helter-skelter to Delhi. And the family then regroups and resets up there. I've still got some of the forks, which is why I mentioned that. So the family carries on, and my grandfather then becomes eventually the Indian ambassador to Brazil, because after 47-48 there was no foreign office. India had to complete all the other offices of government could in a sense transmute under kind of Indian management with Indian objectives, but there was no foreign office. That obviously had to be dissolved because that was the British colonial office, and so they needed ambassadors and so on, and he goes off to Brazil and takes my mother with him, aged 14, because my grandmother's very devout Hindu and won't leave India. And she has an amazing time. He goes to Argentina and then he goes to Brazil. She's educated there. She becomes friendly with Eva Peron, develops an enormously strong sense of confidence, and eventually, when she comes back, she finds that the school and the other girls in the school are just too boring. They haven't lived. They haven't been to parties. They can't talk to men, and she opts to come and study in Britain. And it's during these studies that she meets my father.
Did you know your grandfather?
I should have known him, but by the time, because I'm actually transported, I'll come to that later, but I'm transported as a child to study in Britain, and we stay. By the time I come back to India as a young man, he's elderly, but he's got a dementia. And so I did meet him a few times, but not to know him. It was very sad.
Okay, sorry I interrupted.
No, that's fine. And so we'll come to the meeting of my parents later. On my father's side, it's complicated because I lose track with him. When my parents separate, and so the story's a little bit muddled. But basically, his family lived in the East End. I think lower middle class. But slightly racist and confused about the lady that he marries and so on, and I don't really know any of them. I've met one or two of them. There's a family that we met through his funeral recently in Edinburgh, but I meet a few of his brothers and sisters, and I don't really have any sense of antecedent at all from that side.
What did they do? What was your grandfather on that side? In East London?
I don't know. I mean, I met the grandmother, who was very judgmental and strict, but I can't really give you a full answer on that.
Okay, well, coming down to your parents' generation.
My mother is, I've given you a bit of a flavour of her. So when she comes to London to do a law degree, and she studies at University College, and one day, aged about 19, 20, she's going through, I think, the Students' Union, and she meets and sees this very, very handsome man who is to become my father. Now, he has had a very topsy-turvy life, because he's evacuated during the war up to Gloucestershire, and he's in a school there. But at the end of the war, the boys are all lined up, and gradually their parents or their relatives come to claim them, and this is done over a 5 or 6 day period, so that each day, 50 or 100 boys go. By the end, this is how he tells the story, there are 7 or 8 of the boys left after the 5th day. Their parents haven't come. There's the authorities are getting a little bit agitated, irritated, and so they decide to do a bunk, and they actually just leave and make their way down to London, living rough to some extent. And he eventually knocks on the door of his mother's house to find that she's got an entirely new family. As he tells the scene, she sees him and immediately sort of closes the door behind her to kind of tell him to shove off, because nobody really knows that he's part of the story. Eventually he's found a flat round the corner. Sometime later he goes back to the house and she's moved again, I think to Bristol. He tracks her down again. So it's a little bit of a topsy-turvy life. He's 15, 16 by then, and he opts to go into the army. but he's got higher designs, so he actually applies to be an officer, even though his roots wouldn't suggest that would be a normal route. He enters as an infantryman, as a normal soldier, not a normal private rank, but his application to be an officer is processed. They can't find him because he's already in the army, and they're looking in the wrong places. But eventually the bits of paper join up, and he's then taken down to Sandhurst, where he excels apparently, and he's particularly good with horses. He's promoted. He finds himself in Germany, and he's
what sort of date is this?
We're talking. So he's. So this is 1952.
Yeah.
He's always looking for improvement in himself. He's got that tendency, and he goes to see the head of the regiment where he's based, and he said, "Look, what can I do to get my next promotion up to captain?" He's 22, 23, so he's well on. Given that he had this late start, he's doing really well. And the guy says, "Well, I'll give you something, but you have to find it and come to me." And he studies various papers and documents, and discovers that actually there's a huge Turkish contingent which the British are managing, but there's only one person in the whole of Germany in the British Army who can speak Turkish. So he says, "I'd like to learn Turkish, and I think it would be useful for coordinating these soldiers." And he's sent back to London to, I think, SOAS to study Turkish, and then he meets my mother. He apparently is very, very dashing, and she's very good looking, but she's a very she's from a well-to-do family which had expectations of allowing her to marry according to their matchmaking, and she was already very much on the radar of some very wealthy family scions. But eventually she marries my father, and by all accounts there aren't many, in fact no one from his family comes to the wedding, as I understand it, and I'm not sure that there's any family member from, possibly my grandfather comes. So it's against both codes, if you like. Much based on love. And then I'm born, and there are a few ups and downs, but eventually my childhood is actually in Delhi, and what I remember is my first 6-7 years of life, although I spent some time in Germany, and I think also in Switzerland.
What age did you go to Delhi?
Well, I think I went straight after birth.
Right.
But then I had a spell when my father was stationed back in Germany. And I could speak some. I think the first words I learned were German, and the first thing that I liked was the sort of Bika muesli that you get in that region. So that was my antecedent, and then I eventually was brought up in
What school did you go to in Delhi?
I went to a primary school. I think it was the British school. I enjoyed it. I was, I often led games in the playground. I can remember that. So people used to come to me and say, "What shall we play?" But then my father, who had a French name, thought, he had a great sense of roots and dynasty. I think that's almost his undoing. He sent me to a French medium school, but I didn't know any French, and basically I think I lost a year. I was very unhappy.
What was that school?
I can't remember the name of the school, but I know I spent a lot of time looking out of the window and had to learn degrees of self-discipline and survival, which possibly stood me instead later on in life. My mother kept going back to Britain to continue her studies. They were both very strong characters, and so the relationship was, I think, troubled. And eventually my mother sent me to school, prep school in Britain. I have a memory of going by ship. We went through the Suez Canal. I can remember standing on the front and thinking, how the heck are we going to get through the place? It's so crowded with ships. They went very, very slowly, but I still was quite nervous.
It was about the time of Suez, I suppose.
It was after.
After.
Yes, because it would be 61.
Yeah.
Because I was born in 54.
Yeah.
And so I arrive in Britain, and what I don't know is that in a sense I've arrived to my permanent home. I didn't have that sense at all. And my first winter is 62, I think, the very cold one.
Very, very cold.
Yeah.
Where were you living?
Well, this is a difficulty. We eventually started living in Earl's Court, in a single room, and it was my brother and myself and my mother, and we were really quite poor, and we had to kind of manage. And I can remember having to do every day. I had to sweep the carpet with a brush, because 3 people living in a small space. And so we had to kind of manage as well as we can. I went to a local primary school, I think it was called Fox's, and then eventually my mother went back to, she put me into boarding school, into prep school.
Where was that?
It was in Hastings, and I spent 6 years there, and that became my universe in a way. Your prep school can be a very powerful influence, and it's really at the beginning of my journey to become a sort of British gent or human being, and had to learn a lot of things. I couldn't read or write at that time because of the slightly negligent way or the difficulties I'd had in my disruptive way of my education. So I can remember I was the bottom of the bottom form, and it was a bit of a struggle, and I was the only brown boy. It was very, very cold. I'd gone to Gorringe's and had got my tuck box and my trunk, dropped off there, had that very sad parting that one does, trying to be brave. And then my mother went, and she not only left me there, but she went back to India for a year.
How old were you?
Part of a year. Well, I was 7.5.
Same as me.
Yeah. And I can see those days as if it was yesterday. And you just battle through, and kids are very resilient, and a lot of nasty things happened, which you don't tell anybody, and but you battle through. Maybe we can talk more about it, but
well, were there any teachers at that school who you remember fondly? Or
yes, of course. Teachers are very, very important people. There was a wonderful teacher called Mr. Robson. I never got to know his first name, and he became, if you like, my sort of father figure. I often sat, nowadays this could be open to a lot of misinterpretation, but one sat on his lap and he kind of, told you stories and reassured you and so on. There was a very good English teacher who influenced me, and there was a very good maths teacher who taught me chess. And as I began to blossom, I learned to read and so on, and I gradually moved up, up the scale, if you like, because everything's measured there. And then I became one of the best in the class, and then I got promoted up the classes. But what I really remember is on Friday afternoons we used to have music appreciation, and we used to have double lesson where you listen to the Toy Symphony or Saint-Saëns or something like that, and I just couldn't understand it at all when it started, but after 4 or 5 weeks this is something that you really, really looked forward to. I remember the Mrs. Conville, who was the teacher in the bottom class, read us a history of the Trojan Wars, probably the Lancelot Green version. And I said to everybody, we went to the playground, I said, look, we don't know what's going to happen. Why don't we all pick characters? We'll all be these people, and we could then fight in swords and things. And we didn't know what would happen to our character each week, and we'd come out and we'd reenact the thing. And so one of my friends picked Achilles, which is obviously a very good one to pick, and so on. And I got left with Odysseus, which I liked because it was an odd word. And of course, Odysseus then turns out to be the most interesting, and it's always interested me as a. So that was a wonderful sort of introduction to, if you like, Western education and thinking and sort of fun. But sport was the.
Stop a minute, sorry.
So sport, I got into sport, and I found that a great way to develop friends and also to kind of release energy. And I should now tell you, I have terrible eyesight, and actually how bad
short-sighted.
Very short-sighted. I have something which was actually an inherited condition which can't be cured.
How bad? What's the diopter?
I'm -6, -6.5, but it's not cured by glasses because it's a muscle disease. So it means that I actually can't, and I haven't realised almost until my 30s and 40s the scale of what I wasn't seeing. So I was sort of thinking that I can see the same as everybody else. I knew that I had to sit at the front of the class. I sometimes had to copy stuff of other people. But of course it had an enormous impact on my sport, which I was mad keen on. Now, somehow I managed to play very good football, and I was in the first team for 3 years. Rugby was also fine, and we started playing rugby when we were 8. But I played scrum half, which meant that I was always close to the ball. Cricket was increasingly a problem, and I solved it by being a bowler because I knew where the wicket was. But in the field, it got increasingly scary. And I would just hope the ball didn't come close to me. I would just, every ball that didn't come close to me was a blessing. I tried to bat, and occasionally I would hit a 4, but it would be by accident. But everyone would say, well done, and I wouldn't tell them the truth. So that was a bit of a problem.
Has it been cured?
No, I mean it's.
You can see me though, can you?
I can see you, but not. But what my mind does is it looks at your shape and your clothes, and I think almost I get a video snap of you, and then it kind of plays onto you. But I can't see expressions very well, so that was a kind of problem. But I didn't know about it when I was young. So, I mean, I knew I had limits.
Bookish?
Sorry?
Because myopes are notorious for being very bookish.
Well, maybe I was maybe that was. I mean, I didn't, concentrate on work, and that's how it happened. I want to tell you one other funny story, which is about being in Hastings. In a school. The school was called Hurst Court. It became a old people's home soon after we left, and I think it's now closed totally. But we were there in 1966. And so the Latin master, in his wisdom, decided that we should make a film about the Battle of Hastings. And we were all asked in the holidays to make a costume, and we were decided on our shape and our look. And since I was the darkest boy in school, I mean, I was obviously going to be a Saxon peasant. But I was absolutely determined. That seemed rather boring because you got killed and you had to lie in a ditch very still. So I told my mother I was a Norman archer. So she had to make. She actually didn't make me a bow. She was a bit stingy. So I made myself a bow out of some garden twine and a bamboo stick, and had the archer's equipment. And when we went back, Mr. Nash Williams, the Latin master, said, all the archers here, and he looked at me and he said, "Are you sure you're an archer?" And I said, "Yes." So he allowed me in, and then we all had to line up. But there was each scene had about 8 boys in it, but we pretended by shooting it 2 or 3 times. There were a lot more, and my bow never worked. My arrow went plop, and he had to shoot it again. It still went plop. So not only was I not an official archer because of my looks, but I also mucked up the scene with the really bad shooting.
Stayed with you, I can see that. So this took you from about 7.5 to about 13.
13, absolutely, and gradually I got to be one of the smarter boys in the school. And my parents had by then put me down for a posh public school, rugby. Rugby, yes. So one didn't do the 11 plus, one was going to do the common entrance. I sort of was expected to do well, and built up a degree of confidence.
And how was rugby?
Rugby, I mean, obviously, I learnt a lot there. I gained a lot. Again, the sense of survival techniques that you learn in these schools I think the older you get, the more you realise that you actually learn in these places. But I would say that the values the old Matthew Arnold values, I think, had dissipated a bit. Nevertheless, from rugby and then Balliol, I do see myself very much in the sort of public service mould. That I can't stop doing things that are sort of what one might classify to be for the public. I've never worked for money. I've only ever done things that I think would be interesting and valuable, and so that must have come from somewhere. I had a fantastically influential history teacher there. In fact, two. The head of history department was called, I think it's called Alan Lee, and then the housemaster at my house, which was Kilbracken, was called Warwick Heel. And I just loved history. I can remember the first book that absolutely blew my mind. It was a book on the origins of the English Civil War, by I think Lawrence Stone, I think his name was.
Yes.
And it was just beautifully argued. The whole notion of the Civil War, what people were fighting about, just captured my imagination. And we had to read this and then write an essay. And I wrote the essay, and I can remember just feeling pure pleasure. This was work. Now, when I had to do my Latin unseen, that was work, and it was absolutely horrendous. And I never, although in my first ever Latin exam I'd got 101% for some reason, because they'd asked 102 questions assuming that someone would get two wrong. But it was easy, it was there were one-word answers, or there were short sentences. This was when I was 10. By the time I was 13 or 14, I was really struggling. But history just came along and saved me, and I just loved it. And the whole notion of writing an essay and the way you presented an argument. And I'm very grateful to those two, because they gave me confidence, and they just opened up a whole kind of vista for me.
Were there other subjects that you
Well,
liked?
I became very, very good at economics. And I can't quite explain that. I was also very good at maths, and that was probably from that maths teacher who taught me chess. By the way, he taught me chess at the age of 9, and I became the best chess player at 9 at the school and stayed until 13. So there was something there. It was some mechanical ability in my brain. Maybe it's the kind of Indian gene or whatever. It kept me going. So although I was never a brilliant mathematician, and I could never have done it at university, I was well above average. Economics somehow brought some of that in, though for heaven's sake, economics is not a science. It's not it's open for all kinds of interpretations. But I loved economics, and I started to read The Economist, which I still do. I wrote for it a bit later on in life, and so that was a great subject for me.
What about the games? Did they continue?
They continued, absolutely, but I had to give up cricket because the ball started to go too fast for me, so I couldn't see that. I used to play tennis. I had to give that up. It was too fast. I'll tell you something that scared the life out of me, and I can now, looking back on it, there was a game called rackets.
Yes.
And when you were a new boy at rugby, you had to play every game. In the first few weeks of every term, you had to play every game. Partly they were assessing it, and partly they were giving you a chance to see what you would enjoy. Now, rackets is like squash on a long court, but with a kind of golf ball equivalent. And I couldn't see the ball at all. So literally, and if it had hit you on the head, you're out. You're gone. So I don't know how I survived that. It was pure luck. But I love squash because I could see that ball.
Could you?
Yes, because it's more controlled, and I don't know, I could see that. I always played
fives?
squash. I played fives.
Amazing. To do that.
But it was instinctive. But what I really got involved in was athletics. And that was, something that I could control. I became a middle distance runner. It depended on my drive and self-discipline. My house was right on the edge of the school campus, so I could just get out of the house and run down the hill. It's called the Barbie Road Hill, and just go into the fields. And I used to just run, and all this I used to run privately, and pretend I'd done no training, which is what everyone did. Anyone who studied books was despised. You really, I used to sometimes read at night when I was, with a torch and so on, but you had to pretend not to be doing it. You always had to pretend you hadn't done your prep. You had to pretend that you hadn't studied. You'd pretend that you got everything wrong, because otherwise you were a gut, and that was a really bad term of abuse. If you were a sports person, you were a hero. So, you actually had to hide, and I think this goes into this English sense of anti-intellectualism. I mean, it's one always hears about Scotland or Wales or the French admiring their thinkers and their intellectual aspects, and that was one of the things I disliked most about rugby school. I think that it was very sad. I'm not sure that anyone could have done anything about it, but the currency was sport, or a degree of laddishness, bonhomie, and a sort of faux idleness. If you were an idle layabout who somehow got through, then you were popular. But if you were actually seen as a hard worker, that was really antisocial.
What about religion? Because with many people, certainly at public schools, this is the time when you are confirmed, about 14. But were you known as a what?
It's a very good question, Alan. And religion did play a part. I think in India, if I can go back to India, I can remember my grandmother was very devout Hindu. So I used to watch her do her puja, her prayers in the morning. And I can remember that she took a great pleasure in me. And I often ran away from troubles to her house and used to get a wonderful meal. But if I went into her kitchen with my shoes on, she used to throw the food away. Okay, so you couldn't have leather in her kitchen. It's a little extreme. I think it's absurd. But that made me think about religion. And on Tuesdays we went to the Hanuman temple, which was great fun because you got little sweets and you got a tikka on your head, and there was lots of noise and garlands and so on. So I had that aspect of Hinduism without really getting to the depth of it. When I came to England, I couldn't read, but I had to go to chapel, go to church. We had prayers every morning. So again, this survivalism, I can remember taking my hymn book and seeing how many pages people had turned and turning the right number, holding the book very close so nobody could see if I'd got the wrong, and then just mouthing. I always stood up and sat down at the wrong time, but after a few months I began to be kind of sharper. So I was quite in there, but I got interested, and we read St. Paul's Gospel on Sunday nights after tea. Tea was very early at prep school, if you remember. We used to sit in big school, and the headmaster used to take us through each of the letters, and I really got intrigued. And I also got intrigued partly, I suppose, because it was my name. And so when I got to rugby, I had an openness to Christianity, but particularly to Jesus. I was incredibly impressed by Jesus, his teachings and his life and his example. And I wrestled with this quite a lot. And I can remember going up to see the chaplain, who was a chap called Pearson, very nice man, very welcoming, often had boys round for tea. Food is a big currency when you're in these schools. So anyone who offers a cake, or if you played in a match, you got cakes. So that was a very good reason to be in sports teams. I went to see Mr. Pearson and his wife, and talked about Christianity quite a lot. And I said, "But I can't believe in this. I mean, I admire the guy, but I can't believe in it." And I got the most enormous intellectual trick. He said to me, "Look, there's no way you'll really understand it unless you believe. So what you've got to do is to believe wholeheartedly, and then you will see the fellowship and the whole point of the whole exercise." And I wrestled with this, and I decided I would do it. So for 2 years I was quite an enthusiastic Christian. and eventually when I left school, before I came to Oxford, I had this year in India, and that was when I swapped Christianity for Marxism, really.
But you said it was a trick.
Well, I thought it was a trick because, in a way, the answer to my question was to suspend the question and enter into the belief. So there wasn't a kind of rational or an appropriate
it's the
kind of answer.
Definition of poetry, isn't it? The willing suspension of disbelief.
Yes.
So that's what he was asking.
Yes, he was. So maybe it's a bit unfair, and I'm giving you hindsight. Of course, at the time I didn't think it was a trick, but I thought it was puzzling. And I'm grateful in a way, because it was an important experience, and there's a certain degree of spirituality which has remained with me, and
what's your
still the admiration for Jesus.
What is your spirituality that's remained with you?
Spirituality is I'm more of a humanist, but I'm willing to accept notions of love, accept the idea of sort of a deeper set of emotions, a sort of commonality between human beings. But it's really being an openness to.
But you're not a Buddhist or a.
I'm not a Buddhist, though I might have been if I'd been truer to those beliefs. But I mean, reason and rationalism also, are quite strong in me. So it's really, I suppose I'm in a sense I'm more of a liberal than anything else. So I'm open to ideas, but I'm not going to be a Dawkins. But I can see some of his arguments. I can see where religion has been a huge negative influence on certain people.
Throughout your childhood and then right through this period, did you have any passions or really outside interests? Did you collect matchboxes or collect anything?
Passionate collector of stamps. Went on till I was about 13 or 14 when it petered out.
Toy soldiers?
Those cards, the cigarette cards. Wonderful passion for board games. Loved every single board game. Famously, we loved a game called Diplomacy, which is this First World War game, which takes between 6 and 12 hours to play. And every dinner party that my stepfather and my mother had, and they were very good entertainers, and some very, very interesting people coming to the house. We'd always set up the board game, and as the first people came, we used to trick them into playing, my brother and I. And the games would then start at 7 and finish at about 1, and my mother would be horrendously cross because her supper had been sort of hijacked, and I won't say wrecked because it was often Indian food, so you could keep it warm. And people who became famous judges and journalists and so on, busy sort of playing and arguing. And of course it was a wonderful excuse for us not to have to go to bed early because we wanted to finish the game. So board games was an enormous passion. I followed sport absolutely religiously, and I still do. We lived in Earl's Court, and then we moved to Chelsea.
So you're a Chelsea fan.
And so I actually walked down and got swept by the crowd. I actually got swept into my first game by accident. I love crowds. And I always, I'm not scared of crowds, and I like to see what people are doing and why is there a crowd, whether it's a demonstration or a queue in Russia or a football crowd. And I actually because I was quite small, I got swept under the turnstile. And I came back all terribly proud. And of course my mother was absolutely horrified. But I've been a Chelsea supporter since I was 7.5.
What about music?
Well, I love music, and I did play the piano very actively till I was about 12 or 13, till I went to rugby, and then I found A, I wasn't going to be good enough, and B, it clashed with sport. I mean, you did music lessons, and it affected the rugby, and it was much better to be. I got into the rugby first 15 for a couple of matches, and that was much more important again in the kind of sporting, in the kind of social calendar. So I gave up. I played a lot at school, at prep school, But I was never going to be any good. I mean, it was really mechanical, remembering notes, being diligent. I don't think I was natural.
When you say you love music, what kind of music do you love?
Well, now I'm very eclectic. I love jazz, and I love, great favourites like Leonard Cohen and Joni Mitchell and Neil Young. My sort of key period is the late 60s and 70s. And I'm annoyed with myself that I do like new singers and so on, but I find it I'm not very good at constantly replenishing my stock, because there's always so much more to listen to. And that was my soundtrack, really, and that was when I was growing up and reading poetry and literature and so on. So
this is jazz. What about classical music?
Well, I do like classical music. My stepfather introduced me to Beethoven, who became a kind of hero, both as a human and through his music. And I can remember at the age of 12 just listening to every single symphony many times over, just lying on my back in the sitting room and just marvelling at it, and then I actually gave a talk. We were asked at rugby to come back with little talks which we had to present to the class, and I chose to give one on Beethoven. So yes, I do like classical music, and later on I get kind of involved with the Wilcox family, and absolutely.
So you married David Wilcox's daughter?
I did, yes.
And I've got David Wilcox's baton over there.
It's amazing. I've got one of his batons too in my house.
Of course, David, for the watchers of this, was the choir master of King's College, and
indeed
very distinguished. And there's an interview of him in my series as well.
So I get a great love for choral music through Anne, my wife, and through going to many exciting concerts that David had. And I think the Matthew Passion will be the record that I keep on Desert Island Discs now. So my musical taste has been widened enormously, but I also love Indian music. I mean, if I don't listen to Indian music for a month, or I'm unfulfilled. And I just love, we have this way, we say wah wah, and we, when there's a beautiful turn in the rag and so on. So I'm very eclectic,
and pop music as well.
And I like pop music, and so it's.
Do you listen to music when you're working, or?
I do, not all the time. I also listen to Radio 4 quite a bit. So when I'm actually creating, when I'm writing new stuff, I tend to listen to music.
You do.
But sometimes I want to listen to music, and then I need to do it without doing anything.
The last thing about school was, what about sort of a mixture of politics and official offices? In other words, were you a prefect or head of house or whatever authority? Because, as you know, the purpose of boarding schools was to train you for running the British Empire, and so part of it was to turn you from a fag, which would have probably been abolished by the time you were there, into a prefect. So did you go through that sort of gaining of authority bit?
I think that's a brilliant question. I was a fag. Had to bring coffee and polish shoes, and take dirty kit and so on. And there was a lot of bullying, and I was, I think, probably the last group of people who were beaten by prefects. We had a lot of beating at my prep school. And in fact, when I was beaten first, when I was about 8, what amazed me, and it was simply for talking after lights out and entertaining some of the other kids. A lot of us were crying, the first year. People were crying and so on. So I sometimes told funny stories in dorm. Anyway, I got done and I got beaten. What was amazing was the next morning, I was a hero. So here I was being told I'd done something awful and wrong, and yet the next morning I had friends that, the kind of cool kids were being my friends. Very odd. So beating got abolished at rugby as I was going through the ranks, if you like. And I've never liked authority. So I think I had quite a kind of rebellious streak develop, and I can't put my finger on what it was. But maybe it was that I hated the bullying. And I remember that there were some of us who were bullied when we became prefects, and I did become a prefect, were astonished at the fact that people who'd been bullied started bullying. Because for me it was clear as mud, and I'm not trying to claim myself as being particularly special in this, but it was clear as mud that if that was something that you hadn't enjoyed, why would you repeat it? You know, it was just extraordinary. We had something at my previous school, at the prep school. If you were naughty, the prefects would make you learn 10 dates, and I still know a lot of dates, and I'm actually quite grateful about that. Or you could do an hour of gardening, and gardening was quite good because you could grow things, and sometimes you grew things that you could eat, and that was terribly important. But at rugby, you know, there was a lot of teasing and so on, and to be honest, there were times when I would walk into a room and they'd immediately tell a racist joke.
Really?
You know, and that was quite shocking because I didn't really know why I was being ostracized from time to time. I mean, the whole notion of race came to me quite slowly and late. Probably when I was 13, I suddenly kind of... So that's quite late. But I became a prefect, but I was, I think, quite gentle. And I was asked to do some things that I didn't approve of. I didn't mind being the monitor at night. You had to check everyone go to bed. So I quite enjoyed that. And sort of keeping this kind of sense of order. And then we were asked to do something which I objected. I think we'd agreed that there would be a house council. And the housemaster, who I did admire, I've told you about in terms of history, he reneged on it. And I can remember saying to a couple of other prefects, well, we're going to resign. And so we lined up, and I went in and I said, I'm resigning. And I took off my tie, because he had a special tie, and put it on his desk, and went out, and the other two boys weren't there. So I ended up on my own. But you know, I felt fine. There was only one term left, so I only had one term as not a prefect. But
did you have any? Were there political societies or civil?
There was a current affairs. There was a
society.
current affairs society, which was very.
You were active in that.
I was active in that, and that was popular.
Yeah.
And we got. I mean, we were very privileged to have speakers. I'm not sure I can remember in detail, but I can remember looking forward to the sessions. You know, we had a very good library. Interestingly, it didn't have any marks in it. And when I came up to Balliol and I was asked to read something, and I hadn't read marks, but a lot of the other boys had. So I've left a complete set of Marx's works in my will to the rugby library. I don't know if they'll accept it. They actually had a list of the 100 great books, and you would have thought that
he might have been there.
He might have been included. But yes, in that sense. And I also published an independent magazine. We had an official magazine which was quite irritating, and you know, simply listed results and so on. But I didn't think it would last. But it was irreverent. It was critical. I went up to the headmaster and said because we were told that we had to get permission. And I said, you know, I asked him for £20 towards it. I'd gone round the local shops because we used to be able to buy things from the local shops with little tickets, which the housemaster used to sign. And there were many funny stories where somebody went up and said one tractor, you know, because they just signed the things to see if he was paying attention. And then someone went up and said one haystack, and he said, "Is that to go with the tractor?" So he had actually remembered. But we used to. So I'd got all these little adverts and things. So I got 50 quid. I can remember I needed £100 to print 3 editions. And he said, "Yes, I'll give you the £25, but then I have to check everything that goes in. And I said, well, that's not the point of this. You know that's not the point of this, you know. So I had to refuse his £25. But in the magazine, I called it Flop, because I thought it would flop. And it continued for 2 years after I left. So some of the other kids kept it going. So, you know, there were little moments of opposition. I can remember the tree that the Queen planted 400 years after the founding of rugby was cut down, you know, in protest against once. There were little things like that. There was
insurrection,
yes,
mutinies. We've just got a few minutes left on this tape.
Right.
So I'd like to just take one more subject, which is,
please.
You mentioned that your stepfather. So can you tell me more about your parents, and particularly your very eminent mother and her career?
Of course.
In the last few minutes.
Yes. Well, my mother is a remarkable woman, and really, when we were living when we came to England, I don't remember being influenced so much by her in India. It was really my birth father who influenced me, and we used to go on long walks, and he used to teach me, for example, all the capitals of the world. And sometimes he'd call me down for dinner parties, and people would actually ask me, what's the capital of Uruguay? And I would say Montevideo, and they'd all look in astonishment. But so I had that aspect from my father, slightly military, slightly controlling, slightly authoritarian. My mother had been well brought up, you know, with lots of servants in a big house. But when she came to Britain, as I say, there were just three of us in a small flat, and she taught us she made sure that we learned how to cook things. She taught us how to sew, how to put buttons on, how to crochet, how to iron. It was kind of, you know, it was I mean, I would say it was kind of feminizing, making us, I couldn't say that a man is a feminist, it's up to the woman to say that, but she taught us things which have really stood me in good stead, and rounded out the kind of maleness of myself and my brother. And I think, you know, a lot of credit to her. She battles her way through life, through separation and divorce. She remarries Gary, who's a very, very good man, as a lawyer, and we moved to near Windsor, a place called Bray, between Maidenhead and Windsor, and he's becomes a barrister and a QC, and she starts to get involved in local community work, and because she speaks Urdu and Hindi, she then starts to be a mouthpiece for local families that are now coming in the late 60s to Britain who can't speak any English, and she fights for their rights in social settings, in hospitals, interpreting, and teaches a lot of the kids in school. A lot of them are illiterate at 12, 13, 14. Some of them come on bullock carts to the airport, flown to Britain, and are sitting in houses, and there's a lot of work to do, and she champions them, and eventually she's encouraged to go into local government, where she does well. She becomes the mayor, the first Indian woman mayor, meets the Queen, of Maidenhead and Windsor, the Royal Borough of Maidenhead and Windsor. One of her citizens is the Queen, who doesn't pay rates. Famously, she goes up to the Queen and chides her and says, if you pay rates, all our financial problems will be solved. There's two outcomes from this. Outcome one would be off to the tower with you, and outcome two would be to, you know, rock back on your heels and share the joke. And the second outcome happens. So they become quite friendly. She becomes particularly friendly with the Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Philip. He puts her on a committee on housing, and she visits around the country, particularly to do with migrants and new communities, and she does very well. And eventually she's put on a short list. She's a conservative. I don't think she's a natural conservative. Only a few liberals and lots of conservatives in Maidenhead, so no Labour. And she eventually is put on a list and approved by Mrs. Thatcher to go into the House of Lords. And she's a very feisty woman. She speaks her mind.
Give us her name.
Srila Flather. So she's achieved a lot of firsts for women in the sense that she's the first Indian woman mayor, I think the first non-white woman mayor, the first Indian JP, first Indian woman councillor, and I think the first Indian woman in Parliament. There were some Indian MPs, I think even going back to the 20s, there was a communist Indian MP from Battersea. And I think there was actually one in the 19th century as well, an Indian. But she's, and she's been in the Lords since around 1980.
She was the first Indian woman in the Lords.
Yes, but I say in Parliament because I don't think there has been an Indian woman MP.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. And she speaks her mind. She's very well known. So we think she was the first sari wearer in Parliament. And she wore glamorous saris. She's always owned glamorous saris. She's a very striking figure, and she's a great. She's very friendly, and she's just, and she finds it as easy to like the policeman on the front gate as she would to like the minister of the dispatch box. I mean, she doesn't distinguish in that sense in terms of friendships. I think that's to her great credit and something that she's taught me. And it may be that also, if you have servants and so on, you break down those kind of barriers. You're more used to intermixing. And she's spoken her mind on many things, particularly on education, particularly on race, particularly on women and women's rights and women's employment. And she's now saying things that I think no other public figure is saying in Britain. She's saying some dangerous things that would be considered politically incorrect.
Such as?
Well, she's challenging for example, she's speaking up on whether Muslims should be able to marry first cousins, because that's causing a lot of deformity in birth. She's challenging the notion that a lot of Muslim men have one official marriage but might have several other unofficial marriages, and because it's done in different ways, nobody is actually going in to check that. So these are difficult things to talk about. And for example, even the cases of the girls and the Muslim men, which I also feel very strongly. I mean, the fact that you're not allowed to talk about it as an issue related to either Pakistan culture or certain ways of behaviour prevents you from getting to the bottom of the problem and therefore to solutions. And I admire her enormously for taking on such controversial issues and being able to speak. Now she can do that because she's a woman and because she's, I say Indian origin, actually in a way we're Pakistan origin. But since we were brought up in India, I've always seen myself as an Indian. But now I'm more confused than ever. I should say to you that when I eventually get into politics and try to define myself, I end up defining myself as an Indo-Saxon. But since then, I've now discovered that where's the Pakistani bit coming in?
That'll be a new story. So we've got to your gap year.
Yes.
Tell us quickly about your gap year.
Well, the gap year was enormously important to me. I ended up, as I should have done, back in India, and was able to reconnect with both family and with culture, with food, with smell, with sound. And I had the most amazing 8 months there. I went there as a fairly dedicated Christian, almost an evangelist. I left there more spiritual, slightly Marxist, much more confused. The highlight of it was spending 3 or 4 months working in a drought relief project in Rajasthan, where I was the only Westerner that most of the villagers had ever met. I had very long hair. I had to dig wells in hugely high temperatures, above 40 degrees centigrade. It was so hot that the afternoons were simply spent lying on my back with a towel mopping sweat off me while the other villagers carried on digging. We actually dug by hand, and some intrepid figure had to plant the dynamite and then climb up the rickety ladder, and we all ran away while it blew up, and then we went down and sort of excavated and removed the stone. And it was all because the villagers couldn't use a nearby well because that was a Brahmin well. That hadn't been made clear to me at the very beginning, but when it did emerge, of course, it was quite a revelatory moment. I got extremely ill. There wasn't enough petrol to take me to hospital. I had amoebic dysentery. I suffered greatly, but I was a fit young man, so I could cope with that. But I remember that, and I remember just being aware of how different my life had been in Britain, and how complicated and extraordinary the world was. And that was a really vital moment. And leaving the village at the end was incredibly sad and moving. They threw a huge festival evening for me, and in fact asked me to stay, gave me the privilege of being able to build a mud hut there, and even to pick a bride from amongst some amazingly beautiful women. And there was a serious moment when I was quite tempted by it. Anyway, I went on my travels. I lived a bit like a hippie. I often washed my clothes in rivers. I ate from local dubbers, lived very frugally, managed to go around much of India. Another formative moment was arriving in Calcutta at Howrah Station, and just standing on the station and seeing this sea of humanity, and realizing that some people lived their whole life on the station. They were actually born there. They tried to make a living begging food, and then finding ways of surviving, selling combs or whatever. I mean, that was these sort of moments are enormously explanatory to you. But I came back to Britain quite changed, and obviously being away from the family, I'd got a high degree of independence, a degree of self-confidence. I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I think I was a much more rounded and thoughtful figure. And then, of course, I had this wonderful privilege. In fact, I so enjoyed it, I didn't want to come back to Oxford. My parents had to arrange for the family to ambush me and insist that I came back, and if I really wanted to be a guru or a yoga specialist, and I could always come back afterwards. Of course, afterwards, one's completely changed. I did go, and I had the privilege of going to Balliol, and that was just the great experience of my life, I must say. I was taught by some wonderful tutors. Stephen Lukes was probably my mentor. He taught me every year. I ended up in my last year with a room above his. I learned so much from him, and he, in a sense, brought out a more nuanced radicalism in me, although I did become a Marxist, as was fashionable amongst most of the Balliol students there. We indulged in occupations, and we campaigned against the quota to allow more women in.
This is the late 60s?
This is the middle 70s, actually.
Middle 70s.
I mean, we always harked back to the late 60s because we felt miffed that we'd missed them. So I suppose we were a bit kind of a Monkey generation. But we had two famous occupations, and in the second one I was one of, I think, 6 or 7 or 8 ringleaders who were arrested, despite the university promising that if we left, no one would be. And I was I resisted arrest, and so I was beaten up by the police and taken into into a cell. And when I was released, I'd become a kind of hero. So that was, in a way, affected my reputation and standing for the rest of my time in Oxford.
What were you reading?
I was reading PPE, and Stephen Lukes taught me politics and sociology. I did social theory with him. Another great influence on me was Alan Montefiore, the philosopher, and I'm now working with him on his so-called philosophy forum, which he set up at the LSE. And Bill Weinstein. And Christopher Hill was the master and welcomed me in, and I was very, very, I became very close to him. I was so full of respect. I loved his books, of course, which I'd read as a young history A-level student. So it was an absolute privilege to be there. And in fact, one of the outcomes of all our protests was that I became, I think, the first Oxford student to sit on a governing body. And I ended up sitting next to Christopher Hill every Wednesday afternoon, and he and I would exchange glances through the 2 to 3 hour meetings, and he used to lean over and occasionally said, are you still so keen to be on this committee? Because a lot of it was obviously just routine stuff. but he was a great influence, and also his successor Anthony Kenny, who when I came back to do my DPhil many years later, I became very close to. So they were great figures. I loved going to the lectures of Alan Ryan and Ronnie Dworkin. And though I read Marxism, and also did I was one of the first students to do a paper on the history of economics, which was Smith, Marx and Ricardo. I was really being prepared as not a Marxist. I mean, as obviously a socialist, but the tutors were exceptionally tolerant in listening to our views and just nudging us along or opening up boxes and posing questions. And it took me many years, perhaps even 10 years, before I realized how beautifully I'd been taught. And I'm delighted to say that most of my tutors have remained very close friends of mine, came to my wedding and so on. So that was, it really was a kind of a thrill, that period. And also to be at Balliol. I mean, I can't say that I understood how important Balliol was as a college until I'd got there, when I realised I could really not have been anywhere else. It was the place where everybody came. We had a wonderful students' tea at 4 o'clock, and everyone met. And I was on the JCR committee, and one of my responsibilities was food, and I was in charge of what was called midnight raiding. So at about 11:30 we used to open up the bar, students' bar, and we used to lay out all these sandwiches with all kinds of spreads, and everybody who got a little bit peckish for whatever reasons after the pub or whatever would come, and we'd have a wonderful evening session as well.
Wonderful.
So after that,
how did you get on in your finals? Okay.
Finals I was quite nervous about. I was expected to do well, but I'd seen a couple of friends of mine take a year off. So my reports, I remember, were very promising, but practicing more politics than studying it, that kind of thing. So I was a little bit nervous, and I asked for a year off, and I was refused. And I had a terrible shock, and I actually I almost had a little miniature breakdown, because I thought, goodness. But I knuckled down and I got a very good first. So the tutors again were absolutely right. I thought about doing a PhD, which I definitely wanted to do, but was told that academe wasn't in good shape. I should go off and do something else. And I managed to get one of these very competitive traineeships at the BBC. But before I got there, I was awarded a travel scholarship to the States. And travel actually has been a wonderful part of my life, and it's a thrilling, revelatory experience, as I'm sure you'll agree. And I had 6 months in the States, all paid for, and I managed to get to some 40 states.
Wow.
And it was founded by a very eccentric figure who'd been at Balliol and had loved the experience, and he became very, very rich as a director of Coca-Cola, and left money to send a number of students selected by the college for their contributions to college life to travel to the States, called the Coolidge Scheme. And highlights included going to the camping in Kansas next to people who'd led the Woodstock Festival and were protesting against the Republicans, but also having a ticket to the convention. So having to creep out at dawn, change into the only clean clothes I had in my rucksack, and hot-footing it into the convention, and then creeping back into the camp at night and shouting protest songs. So I had some wonderful experiences, and I went, met many interesting people, including a senior figure in the Carter campaign I stayed with for a week. But then I ended up back in Washington on election night in the White House next to the Ford family. And obviously when they lost, people started to cry, and it was amazing to see all mascara running and these wonderful, elegant figures with their crumpled suits and so on. So I had a wonderful experience, came back and found my traineeship had been not kept open as I'd thought, but had been given to someone else. And I was told I could apply again, but it would have taken a lot of skill to win that competition again. So I became an art critic, not knowing much about art, but there was a gap there, and tutored. and eventually went up to Sheffield to work for United Newspapers as a trainee. So the Yorkshire Post, the Sheffield Telegraph. It was a terrific thing to do because I had a lot more freedom and I wanted to write. It was quite a militant time. The NUJ was very militant. Salaries, particularly in the regions, were very low. I think there were 3 strikes within the first 2 years of my time there. I was on a traineeship.
So this is at Thatcher time?
This was Thatcher time, and one of my scoops was to interview a very young Arthur Scargill about things like climate change. You know, we didn't really realise how significant it all was, but he was coming out. But he was pro-coal, so of course it was. But he was anti-nuclear. So I had many experiences. I became their foreign correspondent, if you like, the Sheffield Telegraph's foreign correspondent, who wrote a weekly column about something interesting in foreign affairs. I could go and cover any kind of features like Northern Soul. I wrote articles about. I wrote about Dutch elm disease. It was extremely liberating and exciting, and I made a lot of mistakes, but you know, that was all part of the learning process. And eventually I left slightly early and got a job BBC TV. But I really wanted to be a writer, so I wrote a couple of articles for the Times, which were published, and I was spotted by someone the editor of the Times Higher Education Supplement, who asked me to join the paper. This was during the Troubles, and the papers had to close for a while. They reopened. I joined as a feature correspondent and social science correspondent, and so I had 4 years in the old times before Murdoch, with these kind of big print magazines, these linotype print machines, which are amazing to watch. They said that they took printers 9 years to learn how to do it. In other words, more than a doctor. That's why they needed to be paid so well. I covered social science, which was actually very much under attack by Keith Joseph. I actually did 3 long interviews with Keith Joseph, which were published. The headlines are interesting. The big article in the Times was Mad Monk on the loose, and the headline on the New Statesman, the cover piece, was Philistine let loose on campus. So you can see how they twisted the stories. But my love was always to, I love journalism, and I got involved with dissident movements, and I had a lot of opportunities to write about my experiences helping dissidents and smuggling samizdat and so on, which was again through my Balliol connections, because they'd been invited to give lectures, they'd been expelled, and they set up a foundation which would send academics regularly to give lectures in places like Romania, Poland, and above all the Czechoslovak Republic. And I got involved in that. I gave a lecture on Gandhi at the special request of Václav Havel, which apparently influenced him. So I was really enjoying it. I could write really long pieces, 2,000 word pieces, which you can't really do very much in journalism. But again, when you talk to someone about an article and they hadn't read it, and it's kind of frustrating. So I thought, well, I ought to try and write something decent, and I managed to get a state grant to go back to do a PhD at Balliol with some of my old tutors, a DPhil, yes.
What was that on?
Well, that was on India, on Indian politics. It seemed to be sensible to work on that for various obvious reasons. And also would allow me a chance to go back to India and do further kind of research and investigation. And the big question always, I think, is why has there been no revolution in India as there has been, say, equivalent in Russia or China? How was it? How did their modernization occur, and why is their political system allow adjustment and a degree of gradualism? So that's what I looked at, and I looked at it in terms of elite formation, what I called accommodationism and co-option. I had a lot of fun, interviewed a lot of great figures, and went to a lot of libraries.
Did you meet the Gandhi family?
I met the Gandhi family. I actually interviewed Mrs. Gandhi in 1980 when I was still a journalist. I said I came from the Telegraph, and they said, straight in, you have the first exclusive interview. And I was in front of the BBC and CNN. What they didn't know was the Sheffield Telegraph and not the Daily Telegraph. I didn't correct them. So yes, so that was very important.
Who was your supervisor?
Now, what I did was, because I was quite mature in the sense that I was a little bit older, I went for a different supervisor for each year. So I had Bill Weinstein, the political scientist, to set the framework. I then had Stephen Lukes, who advised me about power and the kind of sociology of it. I then had someone called Gopal Krishna, who helped me with the Indian elements of it. And then I ended up with Anthony Heath, who's a famous statistician, professor of sociology, who helped me with some of it, because I'd done these interviews, so he helped me doing cluster analysis and so on and so forth. So I was very privileged. And I suppose the last few years were with Anthony Heath, trying to put it together. I managed to squeak it in just before the deadline, because not long after I started on the PhD, two things happened. One is that I was quite heavily involved in London politics and Labour Party politics, and I got more and more involved with the GLC, which was taking a very strong stand against Mrs. Thatcher. And then I got elected to the ILEA. There was the separate, when the GLC was abolished, the ILEA was saved by Keith Joseph, no less. And it was a one-off. It's a one theme election, and I got elected to that and became chair of the influential post schools or further and higher education committee. A marvelous experience. My budget was something like 350 million a year. I looked after 18 adult institutes, 5 polytechnics sitting on the boards, and something like 4,000 youth projects. So I was unpaid, and in fact I lost my grant partly because of that and partly because of marriage. But I was all round London, driven around London. I had a magnificent office in the middle of the city in the old GLC building, and was able to do quite a lot of things. I helped found various foundation courses for migrants, to get them on the road to studies in colleges and universities. We promoted parent governorships on schools. We gave something like 10 to 15% of the budget of polytechnics was from us to do local community work related to communities and skills training. And when the polytechnics became independent, I think they didn't realise that they would actually suddenly lose a huge chunk of their income. So with all that, my studies were sort of, shunted a little bit. But I managed to complete my DPhil with on the very last of the 7 years that you're allowed. After I was abolished on the ILEA, and we had this. You remember this famous? We had this sign which listed the number of unemployed in London on the building. We thought the eyesight of Mrs. Thatcher's room. I mean, it was quite. I think we were one of the last oppositional blocs to Mrs. Thatcher after the Labour Party had collapsed, after the church had been defeated, after academe had suffered. So I think it was actually reasonable opposition, democratic opposition, rather than. I think I was one of the sensible ones, if you like, often under attack within my own party. But soon after we were abolished, I thought, right, now I'll finish my DPhil, get this done, might think of an academic career, might think of a political career. But I got a phone call from George Soros, and was invited to breakfast with him. And I remember the breakfast very well. It was one of the best scrambled eggs I've ever had. It must have been organic eggs and the most wonderfully fresh and fluffy with lovely herbs on them and so on. But in the middle of that, I had hardly had half of it, and then he said, look, he had this big project, and he'd heard about me, and would I like to be in charge of this new university he wanted to set up in Central Europe, which became the Central European University. Of course, I was never going to say no, but I did point out that I had a DPhil which was overdue, and I said, well, I'll work half-time for him until it's finished, and then work full-time. But it could never have been possible, and within a week I was working full-time for him. I did ask him for a file. I said, do you have a file? Do you have any papers? Do you have a proposal? Is there anything that I can work from? And he said there was nothing. So he said, and I said, well, how long do I have to get? What's your vision of getting started? He said, I want the students in as soon as possible. I'd like it to start, next autumn.
Wow.
And we managed. And we managed to get 200 students starting in September.
Which year?
In Prague.
Which year was that?
This would be, I took over in 90, end of 90.
Yeah.
So it was autumn 91. And, it was only possible because my first visit to Prague, to stay in the former Prime Minister's house, which had been sequestrated by the new Civic Forum movement, was with Václav Havel, the president, and then we agreed a building. We were then able to, and obviously one had very deep pockets. I mean, I think that the privilege of, normally one has ideas and maybe a space and a vision, but never the money. This was the opposite. We had the money, we had the vision, but not the logistics. So it was...
What was the vision?
The vision was a university that would allow a part of Europe, Central Europe in those days, which had been frozen, which had been prevented from having a kind of flourishing bed of ideas, to in a sense catch up and be proud of an institution equivalent to the best in the West, of its own, a place that would draw students from all around the region, including Russia, and allow them to go on to serious major study. And I did some of the, I was the head of it, and it was quite exhausting, and there was lots to do, even carrying at one stage $15,000 in cash, because that was as efficient a way to get money in those days as any. But I can remember I also taught, gave some talks and tutoring, and I can remember, for example, asking a student why they'd put some facts which didn't seem to touch on the topic that we were discussing in their essay. And she said, well, where we were taught, every paragraph had to have 2 facts in. And I said, well, but they ought to be relevant. She said, oh, we just thought we had to put facts in. So you can see the kind of differentiation. Often they'd only read 1 or 2 books in a kind of field. I mean, one student had only read Sorokin in sociology. Now, no one in the West had hardly heard of Sorokin, but that was her Bible because it happened to be the book she could take out of the library. So there were some interesting kind of experiences.
Did you come across Ernest Gellner at that time?
Well, recruiting Ernest was one of my big successes. We wanted a number of figures that could give us status and influence and establish our reputation. And I knew Ernest through my journalism days. I used to sit with him in the LSE, and we used to gossip. We used to sit on a table at the edge of the main dining room. In the middle was Ralph Dahrendorf, and Ernest used to sort of say, oh look, there's King John with his barons. He was a mischievous figure, great fun of course. And I knew he often talked about his childhood in Prague. And I think he as much as we thought of him, but he thought of us. He was very proud that he'd had 4 different professorships. I don't know if you remember that. 4 professors. He was professor in Oxford, LSE, Cambridge, and the Central European University. Each was with a different title.
Yes.
Anyway, it was a delight to have him there, and we spent many evenings talking and drinking and walking. and he was such a character. So he was an important figure, and his wife Susan. Working with George was amazing. I mean, he would turn up, and we collect him from the airport, and you could just write off the next 36 hours or even 72 hours of your time, because he slept very little. Meetings with him would just go on until he felt the business was done. He loved meeting new people. He had to meet new people every day. And certainly for 2 or 3 years, I think I was very, very close to him. When we were setting up the project, I packed his suitcases for him. We travelled together. He often didn't carry money, so that was quite amusing. That you have to. I think he still owes me quite a bit, actually, but I mean, not big in any special sense. And we had, and of course, through him, I met so many interesting people. Bronislaw Geremek in Warsaw, a major figure who became their foreign minister, and Amsterdamski and so on, and all the key figures in Prague, including someone who became a bit of a nemesis, which was Václav Klaus. Václav Klaus actually succeeded Václav Havel. Václav Havel was a very shy, gentle man, and almost, I would say, almost better in print than face to face. But very, very moving times with him. But Václav Klaus was much more direct and didn't take well to Soros, and eventually asked us to pay for the building. And Soros felt that was an ungrateful act, since he was now investing, I mean, initially $15 million a year, but probably by then 20 or 25. And so eventually the university had to be closed in Prague and moved to Budapest, his beloved Budapest, even though he was treated badly even in the 90s, and of course more so now. So my last acts were actually winding the university down, and that was probably time when I felt it was time to move on.
When was that?
That was 93, 94. So by 94 I was winding down, but I'd also been I suppose headhunted or invited to apply for a job at Oxford, which was the head of international external affairs there. I worked closely with Richard Southwood, the Vice Chancellor there, who I admired enormously. He was on the Central European University Senate, and I'd got to know him. He was involved from the beginning, actually. And so he wanted or invited me to apply. They, I think, had a very big list of applications. It was a kind of a new, exciting post. However, I managed to get that, and so there was a natural transfer from Prague back to Oxford.
What was that job? What did you do?
That was it was an interesting job. I think I had 6 different departments to run. I had the alumni office to run, the media office, the international committee and affairs, the publications, the events, and then also something called community and government. And actually one of the jobs that came out to be quite serious, and you must have felt this in Cambridge, was the Labour Party attack on the Oxbridge fee income. The Oxbridge students were paid something like 1.4 units of money compared to the average of 1 for other universities, and I was very involved. And because of my Labour Party contacts and because I knew David Blunkett quite well, I actually managed to, I think, play quite a significant role in tempering that down and pointing out the importance of Oxford and Cambridge. It was reduced, but it was then compensated in other ways in terms of special buildings allowances and special research allowances and so on. So I think Oxford and Cambridge didn't actually lose money, but it was repackaged.
The other person who played a major role then was Eric Anderson. Did you know him?
He was at Lincoln, wasn't he? Yes.
He was a headmaster of Blair.
At Fettes.
At Fettes, and made a phone call to tell him to lay off, etc. So the rumour goes.
I think he did. Also maybe Andrew Donis,
yes,
who was an advisor. But what I did with Blunkett was to get him to take part in the first admissions video. We were doing a lot of access work. And I actually persuaded Peter Lampel to set up some of these summer schools in Oxford. And we set up the first video on admissions, encouraging, which was taken to state schools, encouraging them to apply to Oxford. And Cambridge perhaps did the same at a different time. And it was wonderful to have the Education Secretary, David Blunkett, actually actually on the video. So that was, I think, quite a useful softening. Big scandals during this time were the business school. We had a big row over setting up our business school. Of course, Cambridge already had its flourishing business school.
Funded by Middle Eastern.
Funded by Mr. Wafiq Saeed.
Yes, right.
And one of my first responsibilities, dispatched by Peter North, who was then the Vice-Chancellor, who's a wonderfully twinkly man, but got put under a lot of pressure in the building of the business school. He said that I had to go and talk to Mr. Wafiq Saeed about the sources of his money. And I actually had a meeting with him actually in his club in Mayfair, with marmalade sandwiches and cake and very, very more English than anyone could imagine. Very warm conversation in which he promised that his money was not from bad sources, and I reported this back to the Vice-Chancellor, and I think they cleared it through the ethical committee, so we had his money. So there were many different aspects. I was often a bit of a troubleshooter for the Vice-Chancellor, going up to Parliament and dealing with Mr. Saeed. It was very interesting times.
Did you come across my former DPhil supervisor Keith Thomas at all?
Now, Keith Thomas was president of Corpus,
yes,
and I became a fellow of Corpus. I spent 6 very, very happy years there. And I thought that he was the most marvellous president. He was tough. Sometimes governing body was a bit like a tutorial. I enjoyed it. I discovered later when Keith retired after 11 years that some of my colleagues had not always enjoyed it, and some of them were sort of claiming to breathe fresh air. I don't think that's very fair. I think Keith transformed the college. And actually, it's quite clear that when the new rules about appointing professors, whether you could actually apply to be a professor, called the recognition exercise, Corpus quickly proved itself and got the most professorships of any college, even though it was a small college. And I think that's a testimony to Keith, who was involved in every academic appointment, ensuring that the very, very brightest were recruited to Corpus. I mean, it was extremely able and successful college, and great fun.
Did you come across another of my teachers, Brian Harrison?
Brian, yes, I was very close to Brian, and he
was at Corpus too, wasn't he?
Yes, and he ran the dictionary eventually,
yes,
and wrote very interestingly about British politics. Well, funny enough, that I think Brian and Keith might have been my closest friends there. I had a wonderful time, and I think I'm very grateful to Keith because he included me in a lot of things. They had this very good system of appointing different fellows as visitors in charge of different aspects of college life. So I was a visitor for the silver, and actually learnt all about the marvellous silver collection that Corpus had. And it was all laid out one day in the dining room, and I had to inspect it all. And not being an expert, I was guided by the college's expert, and I'd pointed out various dents and so on, and we checked 1 or 2 missing items, and these were all busily dealt with. Another year I was the visitor for buildings, and I pointed out, again, I mean, I'm not an expert on buildings, certainly not historic buildings, but I did point out a nasty stain in the chapel ceiling. And they said, "Oh, that's been there for a while." And I said, "Well, can I be the one to ask it to be investigated under my period?" and they put a ladder up, and they found that someone had chucked a Wellington boot up there, and it had blocked a place where the water was gathering. And it was actually extremely helpful that had been done, because that might have caused untold damage in the long run. But yes, Keith was. I was actually on the university council because of my particular responsibilities for external relations. Along with the registrar and the secretary of the council, we were the three officers that attended. So I attended that for more than 4 years. And I think Keith Thomas, he didn't speak very often, but when he spoke, there was an audible silence in the room. And I would say he was very much the conscience of the university. When the university seemed to be digging a hole and becoming a little bit too mercenary, he would claw it back. The other great figure on the council, who also had a very powerful voice, I think, was Ralph Darendorf. And I got to know him because I was on the
Nuffield, was he?
He was the he was the warden of St Anthony's.
Oh, yes.
And again, I got to know him through my journalism at the LSE. And absolutely outstanding figure, and of course major figure in all the developments in Central and East Europe in the 80s, and then in the period where they were being brought back into Europe, if you like. And so, I mean, although obviously with his amazing contributions to German life, so dedicated to Britain, and so enthralled to the way we did our politics. So he was a wonderful figure as well.
All the people in your life are wonderful, but do you ever meet people who really don't get on?
Well, that's a good question. Well, yes, I mean, I did go on after that job. I went on to work with George Weidenfeld, and I was incredibly impressed with him. But he could be very sharp.
What was this? Was publishing, was it?
He was a publisher, Weidenfeld and Nicholson. I suppose when I say wonderful, it's because these are the people I admire. I mean, I'm not remembering some of the people that or I'm not recounting some of the figures that I'm not admiring so much. And of course, there is a range of that. But
what were you doing with Weidenfeld?
Well, with George was a kind of he was a kind of a live wire, always setting up. He was an impresario figure, and although he came to Britain in the 40s as a refugee, and actually got involved in helping the war effort at Caversham, I think, listening because of his languages. He then went to work in the founding of Israel. And he was quite, he was a little bit too pro-Israel for my liking. So we did actually disagree on that, and eventually we just agreed to disagree. But he was very concerned that that UK was drifting away from Europe, and particularly under the latter bit of Mrs. Thatcher's premiership. And so he wanted to set up some kind of club that would promote intellectual discussion and links across Europe. And that became what was called the Europeum, a sort of suitable Latin word. And it was a club built up of universities. Now, I was quite involved in that while I worked for Oxford as the Director of International Affairs. I was the Oxford representative. But we weren't quite sure what to do with it. We knew it was a good idea, and we knew that lots of people were supporting it and welcoming it and giving it money, but it had no kind of focus. So when I finished my 5-year stint as the Director of International Affairs, very exhausting, very unloved. People in bureaucracy in Oxford, I don't know if it's the same in Cambridge, are often undervalued. And there's always some person who you think you admire who says, wouldn't it be better if you didn't exist and we had more professors? Even though you've worked 60-hour weeks protecting the university's reputation. So I was content to leave that, and then got involved with George building the Europeum up. And he was the founder of it. He brought in the early money, and he had all the connections. So yes, I mean, there were times when he was quite sharp and tough-minded, but to me he was quite avuncular. So that made it a nice reputation. In his room, he was surrounded by portraits of popes and masses of books, all the books that he helped publish. He published biographies of all the sort of famous 20th century figures. He had these literary salons in his flat in Chelsea on the Embankment, and I was privileged to go to a number of them. And
I think he published my uncle, Robert Rhodes James's biographies of Churchill and Rosebery and things like this, which I hope he had on the show at the shelves.
I mean, you'd go to the dinner and you'd find yourself sitting next to Lord Rogers or Claire Tomlin or Umberto Eco. I mean, it was kind of a privilege, and being a small fish, it was quite entertaining and enriching.
You didn't keep diaries, did you?
No.
Pity.
I always meant to.
Yeah, it would be fascinating.
It would be fascinating. So, I mean, I saw him every month, and I did ask him about the popes, and he said, well, he was fascinated by popes because they had no money and they had no army, and yet they had enormous power. And so he used to read biographies of the popes and study how they could have influence. And I suppose in a way that was a little bit like him. He didn't actually have much money himself, although occasionally I think he married women who were not on the breadline. He didn't have any armies, but he had power through his personality and through his ideas, and he would enrich occasions, whether it was a tea party or a dinner, and he would always be fizzing and promoting things and proposing things. And actually, if you look back at his life, he set up so many different institutes and organizations and networks, and he set up something called Ameris, which was America, Europe and Russia, tripartite meetings of elite decision makers, meeting once a year in each of the three continents to discuss how to share ideas and to pool ideas. And the European and his club of three, which was Britain, Germany and France, meeting, diplomats, power brokers, politicians, bankers, very close to bankers, obviously needed them for funding his many projects.
Does that link up with someone you mentioned earlier, Rothschild, Victor Rothschild?
Well, Victor Rothschild, I always admired him. I got to know him when I was a journalist, because he was appointed as the chairman of the inquiry into the future of the Social Science Research Council. Keith Joseph had decided that sociology particularly, but maybe humanities more generally, was too left-wing. He admired, he found the economists particularly, and including, the famous economists here at Cambridge, were generally too Keynesian. He liked Patrick Minford up in Liverpool, who was a bit more monetarist and different. And there is something to be said for making sure that there isn't, a degree of diversity amongst ideas. Anyway, he was convinced that it was all a big Marxist plot, so he set up this inquiry, ostensibly to abolish the Social Science Research Council, and he appointed Victor Rothschild to chair it. And
Michael Posner was involved.
And Michael Posner was the chairman of the SSRC. I got to know him quite well. And I went to interview Victor Rothschild, and apparently he didn't like journalists, or he decided that they weren't that useful. But somehow we got on, and I did a profile of him. And in the profile I happened to mention that he felt his greatest achievement was hitting 54 not out in a school match. And he was so thrilled that someone had actually mentioned this in print that he and I became quite good friends. And so he was able to give me the inside track, and I wrote a series of 5 very long articles about this inquiry and the biases in the inquiry and so on. And eventually Victor Rothschild came out with the conclusion that the SSRC should be saved, but maybe we should change the name. And it could be called the Wissenschaft Research Council. But what happened in the end, it was called the Economic and Social Research Council.
Yes. I remember I was
But
there.
I was very, very... amazing man. He would write, anything he wrote would be as sparse as possible. So he had this very, very excellent secretary, and he used to write his letters and notes, I don't know if you remember, on thirds of a foolscap sheet.
Mm.
So he couldn't write more than a paragraph. And he would edit and edit, removing every word until it was as sparse as possible, and then he would send it. So the European was an amazing experience for me, because it allowed me to travel around Europe, linking Oxford and the various leading European universities in each country. And my task there, as it emerged, was, as I saw it, to bring brilliant young scholars together to discuss issues of common concern. And in that process, in a sense, making them feel more European, more collectively European, but not in an uncritical way. I mean, we were never critically supported of the European Union. And I remember one great debate with Roy Jenkins, who I got to know because he was the Chancellor, and I used to travel with him as the Director of External Affairs. I always remember his enormously long feet, and he was really quite, I mean, for somebody who was very serious-minded, he liked a jolly jape and a bit of a, so he used to make, a lot of witticisms, and sometimes he talked about himself in the third person, as once he'd put on his hat as a historian. I mean, he was very amusing. And he had a debate with the future head of the European Union, the president of the European Union, the Italian, I've forgotten his name now, and they discussed what makes a European. Were people born as Europeans, or were they made as Europeans? And they kind of disagreed. And Roy thought that actually you're often born linked to your country, but by your experience, and this was part of the Europam's mission, if you like, mixing with other Europeans, travelling, sharing ideas, you became more European. So that was interesting experiences for me, and also watching the kind of beginnings of our Euroscepticism emerge. I mean, no one ever thought that it would get to the level that we've now reached. And in a sense, it's I have to say it's a bit of a failure for our project, because it was not our mission to stop it happening, of course, but it was to encourage Britain to feel more encompassed within Europe. The sort of Voltairean idea of the Republic of Letters, where academics travel freely, share ideas, work together on joint research projects, and students mix. And I've met I've got to know Barroso quite well. And I actually organised an amazing debate at the Oxford Union, which was deemed to be the most significant since the 1930s one about King and Country, because I had on one side Barroso and Nick Clegg saying that Britain and Europe were better together. That was the motion. And on the other side we had Nigel Farage and William Cash. And apparently people queued in the rain for more than 6 hours to get in.
When was this?
This would be, this was just before the referendum.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
And it was major, the people. The trouble is that with all this health and safety stuff, the number of people who can get into the Oxford Union is so restricted. So I think they could only get 600 in.
Yeah.
When in previous times they'd had 1,000 plus. So it was, and it was electric. It was an electric moment. Of course, the better together, the Remainers, if you like, trounced the other side. But I think the other side got, I think it was something like 500 to over 100. So they got over 100, which is interesting at a university like Oxford. Of course, it would be done on the debate rather than on what you previously felt. And since then, I've widened my interests since I left the European. I left the European about a year ago, having done, on the 25th anniversary, I retired. We had this enormous dinner in Balliol, and hosted by Chris Patton, the Chancellor, who's on our board. and we had Barroso and various other figures there, and it was it was wonderful because it happened to be my old college as well, and a lot of my tutors were there and so on. So it was a very nice moment of retirement, and since then I've managed to. I mean, I wanted to be quieter and spend more time reflecting, but I've ended up doing more things, and one of the things I've got involved with is my interest in the Commonwealth, which is really going back to my roots. I think I mentioned that eventually, when I was on the ILEA, I was the only Asian origin member, and I found myself more and more speaking at meetings of ethnic minorities and blacks, and began to call myself an Indo-Saxon as a way of describing. I mean, I was in the Black Caucus, and if you're non-white, you're black, but I thought it was more interesting to be an Indo-Saxon. And it made me reflect more on my roots and on the Commonwealth and so on. Now, the Commonwealth, I think, is much less effective than it should be. And I'm afraid that's perhaps down to relatively poor leadership and so on. But also, the world is split more into regional trading blocs rather than the sort of globalized links that the Commonwealth had. But nevertheless, there's a lot of shared values and shared histories. And I'm one of those who believes that that democracy can be a value that the Commonwealth can promote. So working to abolish the death penalty in some of the Caribbean states is important. Working to promote egalitarian rights for women, for LGBT and so on in Africa. These are things that we can usefully do, or even free media in places like Zimbabwe. I mean, it's been quite interesting. I'm involved in the journal of the Commonwealth, which is called the Round Table, from those original Round Table discussions from the turn of the century. So I feel connected to that, but I also feel frustrated because it's such it could be so much more influential if played right. We do know that Macron is quite jealous of the Commonwealth because a couple of French states have joined the British Commonwealth, and he's now got a strategy to revive the francophonie, which isn't doing at all well. But I don't think the Commonwealth is as powerful or influential as it could be. Though, strangely, if we hadn't been in this Brexit mess, with Britain is now the chairman, has the chairmanship or the chairship in it goes by rotation, having hosted the last summit, and that's quite unusual because usually Britain has to play because of the colonial link, has to play a background role, but it's done it very well. So it could be a chance to go forward. Much depends on India, and much depends on Modi. If India actually came in and played a role, as Nehru did. I mean, Nehru arguably saved the Commonwealth in the 50s by letting India join, against the wishes of many of his Congress politicians. So I'm very involved in that. I'm now chairman of something called the Adam von Trott Memorial Committee, which builds relations between Germany and Britain through Adam's studying at Oxford. And the Germans have set up a foundation to match our foundation, so we're setting up scholarships and lectures and exchanges and workshops. And I run a foundation which brings Pakistani students to Cambridge and Oxford. Have done that for 25 years, which again goes back to my roots because we originally came from Lahore. And the lady who left the money actually came and had tea with me and said, I've come to make you the chair. And I said, well, I'm far too busy, but I'm so glad I did it because it's been so rewarding. Just to see the pleasure of these students doing so well, but also having a chance to link back to Pakistan. And I'm involved in youth work in London, which goes back to my ILEA days. Again, something that I've been trying to leave for 30 years, but again, it's so rewarding, and I'm able to bring a team of members from the youth club. These are disadvantaged youngsters, mostly black, from single parents. They come up and play a team from University College Oxford each year in a match, and to see the two cultures clashing, one a well-drilled team and the other much better footballers, but very not playing very much as a team and shouting and all running after the ball. It's just and then meeting in the bar afterwards to share a drink is a great experience.
Well, one last question about your family. I mean, you mentioned earlier marrying. Can you tell me something about your family?
Yes. So I went to a dinner party with a mutual friend in her late 20s and met my future wife, Anne, at the dinner party. And we got married after 4 years. Anne is the daughter of David Wilcox, who's a famous musician, of course, a Fellow of Kings. And I remember soon after meeting her, with my journalist hat on, I realised that he was the director of the Royal College of Music, and they were having a big event. So I thought, well, can you invite me to this event, and I may be able to get a story out of it. And it was it was a big fundraising, and I think Noel Annan was perhaps the chairman, because he was involved. And I went to interview David, and discovered that he had a great penchant for soups and chocolate pudding, and that's what we had for lunch. And we got on very well. And I'm not sure whether he knew I was a suitor for his daughter. But soon after we got married, and we actually got married in the chapel in King's with the choir, and Anne's brother Johnny, who is a conductor and a composer, put a Tagore poem to music as our anthem. We had the wonderful celebration on the lawns just outside your room, Alan. And the college was closed off. I don't know if that's part of the rules or whatever, but the porter decided. And and then we walked through the backs, Anne and I holding hands with Anne in a beautiful white dress and my now morning dress, back to Grange Road and had our sort of wedding lunch there. And spent a little, getting to know David over 30 years, playing cards with him. We had a rivalry in chess, playing frisbee on the beach, doing his mazes, which he always did on the beach, and obviously attending his wonderful concerts, and especially annually his Matthew Passion. Has opened up a whole new range and vista for me in terms of music and British life, really, and then visiting with him some of the graveyards in northern France, travelling in the Netherlands, and also the famous battle on Hill 112, which his Cornish regiment was involved with, and where he distinguished himself and went on to earn the Military Cross. So it's been a privilege to know him, and I've been very happy together for more than 30 years now. So that was, as they say, the best decision one makes.
Well, this has come in a beautiful round circle. Here you are sitting within eyeshot of the chapel, and
indeed.
The director of music is just retiring, Stephen Cleabury, and we have a new director of music. So you started in India and ended up in King's. So thank you very much indeed. That was a lovely interview.
Thank you very much, Alan. I very much enjoyed it.